Hello, welcome to highlights from Grand Swiss Riga round 4. First, I'm going to cover a position from Parham Maghsoodloo Aryan Tari game, and we start from this position. Here white played a4, and it allowed Tari to exchange and take on f2. Instead, if he played something like rook d1, if black tries to double his rooks on the d file by rook d7, white can play f3, and after queen g3, he can take on c5, and this looks much better than what happened in the game. But also, black has a passed h1, and maybe that's what threw Maghsoodloo away from this line. So he played a4 instead, and now he allowed this, queen f2, and now he tries to be active with rook d7 because there's nothing to do else. g3 pawn is very weak, and he needs to generate some counterplay. Bishop g5 was played to defend f7, and now queen d3 to defend the g pawn. But now Tari plays bishop e3, covers the third rank, and now still attacks the g3 pawn. Bishop takes on e5, and now rook e8. Bishop goes back to b2, and now he takes on g3. White takes on a7, and now the h-pawn starts moving forward. And Maghsoodloo played rook e7, tried to exchange rooks and somehow to deliver perpetual check. If he tried queen d7 to attack the rook and the f7 pawn, then just rook f8 would be played, and after rook c7, then just queen f4 attacking the e4. So h4 was played, and now rook e7. Black just took and went king h7, queen e7, and now queen g4, defending from any checks on f5 in the future. And now he goes king d3, but now the h-pawn starts moving, and if he takes the bishop, then h2 will just be too fast. And he tried desperately something, bishop g7, but queen takes, and on queen h4, queen h6, he tried this, but after queen h5, he's out of checks, and the h-pawn is going to be a queen. Next position is this one, and here white played g4, and black played rook f1. Rook f1, and his idea was to, when white captures, to play c2, but now after king g2 and promotion, white made a fortress by rook f5, and now they shuffled for like 50 moves, and eventually it was a draw by 50 move rule. It was a move 51 now, and they ended it at the move 102. After some shuffling, black couldn't really manage to get this formation broken. Instead of rook f1 in this position, black should have played just rook c8, supporting his c-pawn, and in case of rook h1, he would push, and on rook c1, he would go king e3. And now this is a winning position, because if now white tries to support his g-pawn by king g3, now black is forcing white to give up the rook, and after king f4, king d3, and if white starts pushing the pawn like g5, now black's king is following the g-pawn. And if king wants to shoulder black's king, now he cannot follow up until the end, because he always has rook f1, and he can always get closer. So if he tries to deflect black by his a-pawn, then he doesn't care. He just plays rook f2, king g7, and now king e6. And if he plays g6, now rook a2. And if king h7, first give a check, king g7 and rook h5, stopping the a-pawn and also cutting off white's king. If he tries to go to g8, king f6, g7, and now after rook g5, he's going to capture the g7 pawn, and later he will just collect the a-pawn. Next position is from the game between Hans Niemann and Aleksandra Goryachkina. And here in the time scramble, Goryachkina played knight f7. Instead, if she played queen c6, now black has two options. He can go either to e7, after which queen c7, king e6, because if you go to the 8th rank, it's a checkmate on g8. So king e6, queen f7, and after king d6, rook g6, king c5, queen a7 would happen, and after rook b6 now, this is a checkmate. So black would have to capture on e5, and after rook f3, black would be forced to give up a queen for a rook. If he gives a check, rook f1, and if queen e3, then king h1 would be very dangerous for black. Rook f5 is a strong threat, and also queen f6 is a threat. So here, if queen e1, rook f1, probably queen f1 is the best, and after king f1, rook h8, this looks winning for black, for white. Instead, she played knight f7, after which it became tougher to realize the advantage. Now she played e5, but now king runs to the queen side. King c5, and now queen a7. King b4, and now they just repeated moves. Because he didn't want to allow king b3 taking with check. It would be reckless. And she maybe didn't want to allow, after she captures on f7, to go for something like d3, which would be a bit dangerous. This one has to be the biggest blunder of the tournament so far. Kiril Georgiev was white here, and he took on e4. And after black took on e4 back, he had an idea to take on e4 and play queen f5, captures back on e4, but now both players missed this tactic. Black played queen d7, and after queen e4, to make things even worse for black, he lost that game in the end. But I won't go that far. I'll just show this blunder. Here, black had an option of playing rook e6, and white is not able to capture on e6 because the rook is hanging on d1. And if he tries to hold this pin by playing rook e1, now black has g6, kicking the queen away from f5, liberating from the pin. And it would be a game over because it's just a rook up. In this position, Alexei Shirov was white against Latvian GM Neiksans, and he played rook b6. Black played knight d7, and now Shirov plays very imaginatively. He plays rook e6, and after fe, he took on d5 because black is not able to capture back because of bishop d5 and capturing the rook on a8. And now black's pawns on e6 and d4 are real targets. And that's kind of a compensation that Shirov was hoping for. And here, black played rook a7. it was better to just go rook c8, and in case of knight f4 to block the bishop by knight c4. And in case of bishop e1 to defend the pawn first on e6, but now white would have knight e6. And it is possible to play like this because after king e6, knight e3, pinning the knight. And even if black defends, now white has a5. And if black steps away from the pin, he can take. And after knight e3, because if he takes on b6, now white has c4 and he will start pushing his two pawns on the queen side, and I think it's better to do it like this. Get the knight off the board and to keep only this bishop alive. And on king c6 to play c4, and after this the position will be quite balanced because white has two passed pawns in the center, but also black has a rook and also this a pawn, which might be a hope for black. So after this, black plays rook a7, and now he's doomed to passivity. After knight f4, knight b6, he took on e6, and now it's not possible to capture on a4 because of this cover check, like this, and he would lose the knight. So he plays bishop e7 to step away from any discovered possibilities, and now knight e3 happens, king h8, and now white starts pushing his powerful pawns. Knight has to go back because it's attacked, and now a5 to not lose this a pawn. Knight d7, and now c5. These pawns are just unstoppable. These pawns are just too fast. Knight f8, and now they exchange, but now bishop c3. Rook b7, and now, even though he plays rook b7, puts the rook on the b file, he doesn't have a decent square to go to. That's why bishop c3 was played, to play against rook b2, potentially. And now just d5. And in this position, black chose to give up a piece for two pawns. If he played something like knight d8, then c6 would be very powerful. And after rook c7, bishop e5. And rook c8, bishop c4. And now a6 pawn is hanging, and there's really nothing to be done. Knight can go to f5. If he tries to defend, then even c7 works, and on knight b7, for example, knight f5 would be too strong, because even if you capture, you can take on a6, and next is promotion. So he took on a5 here, and white plays c6 first, and black tried to defend, but after c7, took on a5, and on rook c1, knight f1 was played. Bishop d6, he's going to take the pawn eventually, but there are those two light pieces, bishop and knight, which are going to support the remaining d pawn. Now g4 to make some space for the king, and they exchange, but now knight goes into play. Rook c1, king g2, and now black tried to get closer with his king, but after bishop c4, rook a1, now this d pawn is just going to roll. Bishop e6, trying to get d7, and after king e7, knight f5 and knight d6. Next move is going to be either knight f7 or knight b7, so in this position black resigned. This position is from the game between Antenaina Rakotomaharo and Velimir Ivic, and here white had a pawn up, but but his king was in some kind of danger. Black played queen f3 here. He tries to play rook e4 and to take on g4. King c1 was played, and now rook e4. Queen c3, trying to exchange queens first. Because if he takes, he cannot really capture on g4 because the b pawn will be too fast. And he's going to create problems to black. So he wants to avoid it first by queen f4. And he plays queen d2. But now Ivic takes on g4. The b pawn starts rolling, but rook b4 was played. And after queen d3, he gave a check. He took on f2, and they repeat once. But now black plays queen e1. Now, of course, white doesn't want to exchange queens because it would lead to a rook ending, which is totally lost. He plays this, and after rook b1, white tried to get perpetual, but after queen e3, king c4, and rook c1, white resigned, because if he plays king b4, then this is a checkmate very soon. So after queen f3, maybe it was best to go rook c3. It looks quite scary because after queen e2, king c1, queen a2, now black is threatening checkmate, but actually after rook d3, he covers the first rank if black gives a check, and if rook c8 happens, rook c3 can be a good defensive move, and after queen a1, king c2, it seems like white is going to defend this position. This one is from the game between Alexei Sarana and Alan Pichot, and here black had an option of forcing a draw. Not forcing a draw, but taking some counterplay. He played in the game rook d3, but he should have played rook c8. And if white takes on a7, he takes on c3, and now the rook is badly placed on a7. He belongs behind the pawn here, but he's on a7, so this position should be a draw, because black is going to just get behind and keep this rook very passive on a7. So after rook c8, if he tries to defend, then a5 is very strong, and after rook a3, rook c4 is a nice move. Because now he cannot really develop like king e2 because of a4, and he's trapping the rook there, and basically you're playing a pawn ending, because also this rook on c4 is trapped. Those rooks are mutually connected, and it's basically a pawn ending on this side. So it should be a draw. And if he takes on a5, then he takes on c3, and like I said, this rook on c3 is so active, and it's not possible to make any progress. If he plays g4 to get his king out to f4, then black can play g5. And if white tries to attack the e4 pawn, then black can take the a pawn, and 4 versus 3 is a draw. But instead, in the game, rook d3 was played, and after rook c7, rook d2, a4, rook c2, and now g4, g5, rook a7, rook c3. Now the difference is that white is able to get his rook from the a file. He goes rook d7, and when black tries to attack the pawn, now rook d4. Rook e5 and now rook b4. Now the rook is much more active than in the previous variation. King g7 was played and now white slowly improves his position, pushes the pawn slowly. Rook c6, king e1, and now white is cutting off the black's king. By rook f5, king g6, king d1. And after a couple of more moves, black resigned, because if he plays something like f6 here, white's king is going to develop. c1, 2, and after king d1 he's not able to capture because of a7. And if he goes back, then king goes up, 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 and goes to b7, pushes his a pawn, and that's game over. Thank you for watching and have a good day. Bye.